Imagine a man who never learned the meaning of the word no. For 30 years, Arthur Vance was the pillar of a small town called Oak Creek, a man whose hands were calloused not just from his own labor, but from carrying the heavy burdens of everyone else. He was the first one there when a basement flooded and the last to leave when a friend needed a loan that both parties knew would likely never be repaid. People called him a saint, a hero, the kind of neighbor that many believe doesn't exist anymore in our modern world. But as the sun sets over a quiet suburban street today, that same man sits on a porch swing that he built with his own hands, staring at a bright orange foreclosure notice taped to his front door. The house is silent, the lights are cut, and the very people he spent his life saving are nowhere to be found. We are raised to believe that what we give to the world will eventually come back to us, that kindness is a shield that protects us from the harshness of life. We are taught that being a good person is the ultimate currency, and that a life of service leads to a life of security. But for Arthur, every act of generosity was actually a brick removed from his own foundation until the entire structure was ready to come crashing down. He thought he was building a legacy of respect and a network of people who would have his back if things ever went south. He didn't realize that by always being the one to provide, he was training the people around him to see him as a utility rather than a human being. The tragedy of Arthur Vance isn't just that he lost his money or his home. It is the realization of who was holding the hammer when his life finally shattered. Tonight, we are looking at the mechanics of a total collapse, a story that challenges everything you think you know about being a good man. This is not a simple tale of bad luck or a poor economy. This is a cold, calculated look at how the most virtuous traits can be weaponized against you by the people you trust the most. By the time Arthur realized he was being hunted by the very individuals he promised to always protect, the trap had already closed. He was a man who believed in the American dream of hard work and helping your neighbor, but he found himself living a nightmare designed by his own kindness. It raises a question that most of us are too afraid to ask ourselves. When does helping someone else become the act that ultimately destroys you? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a man like Arthur ends up losing everything, we have to look at the players involved in this tragedy. There is the victim, a man who believed that his value was tied to his usefulness. There is the suspect, or rather, a collection of individuals who treated Arthur's heart like an open bank account with no withdrawal limit. And then there is the setting, a seemingly perfect American town where the grass is green and the secrets are kept behind closed doors. We have to ask ourselves, who actually did this to him? Was it a single person with a grudge, or was it the collective weight of a community that simply took until there was nothing left to take? What shocking revelation could possibly explain why a man's lifelong commitment to his fellow man would end in such a cold and lonely fashion? Arthur Vance wasn't born with a silver spoon. He was born with a sense of duty that felt as heavy as lead. Growing up in the heart of the Midwest, he watched his father work himself to the bone to provide for the family, and Arthur adopted that same code of conduct before he even reached high school. By his mid-50s, Arthur was the owner of a successful small construction firm, a business he built on handshakes and honesty. He wasn't just a boss. He was a mentor, a father figure, and a safety net for every employee he ever hired. He was a man of simple dreams, a man who loved his wife and his community, and a man who possessed a fatal flaw. He couldn't stand to see anyone else in pain, even if it meant ignoring the growing cracks in his own life. There was a specific relationship that acted as the catalyst for the events we are about to uncover. It involves a younger man named David, a protege whom Arthur took under his wing when David was at his lowest point. Arthur saw a younger version of himself in David, or perhaps he saw a project he could fix. He gave David a job, then a promotion, and eventually, he gave him access to the inner workings of his business and his personal finances. It was a friendship built on a foundation of lopsided sacrifice, where Arthur was always the provider and David was always the recipient. Friends and family saw the red flags, the subtle ways David seemed to expect more than he earned, but Arthur brushed them off, believing that his guidance would eventually turn David into a man of character. As we move toward the center of this mystery, the tension begins to mount. For years, the small leaks in Arthur's life were manageable. A missed payment here, a forgotten debt there, all covered by Arthur's tireless work ethic. But the environment was changing, and the people Arthur had spent decades carrying were starting to get restless. They didn't see a man who was tired. They saw a man who had always been there, and therefore always would be. The foreshadowing of the coming danger was hidden in the quiet conversations at the local diner and the shifting eyes of the people Arthur called his brothers. They were no longer grateful for the help. They were dependent on it, and dependency often turns into a quiet resentment that can become dangerous when the well finally starts to run dry. The incident that changed everything didn't happen with a bang, but with a series of choices that felt right at the time. It began with a large-scale municipal project that Oak Creek desperately needed. Arthur, ever the servant of the public, agreed to take on the contract with a razor-thin profit margin just to ensure the town stayed afloat during a local recession. He put up his own house as collateral to secure the materials, believing that the town and his business partners would honor their end of the bargain. He was working 18-hour days, his body aching and his mind clouded with exhaustion. But he kept pushing because that is what Arthur Vance did. He believed that this final act of service would be his crowning achievement, the thing that secured his legacy forever. The first question we must answer is one that haunts every man who has ever tried to lead a quiet, honorable life. How does a person go from being the most respected figure in his community to a social pariah in the span of a single night? It seems impossible that 30 years of goodwill could be erased by a few signatures on a legal document. Yet, that is exactly what happened to Arthur Vance. We see the bank statements filled with red ink and the weary expression on a face that used to radiate confidence. But the numbers on the page don't tell the full story. They don't explain why the phone stopped ringing the moment the money stopped flowing. To understand the collapse, we have to look past the financial ruins and examine the fragile social contracts Arthur believed were written in stone. At what exact point does the noble act of helping a friend transition into the dangerous territory of enabling a predator? This is the second great mystery of Arthur's downfall. He believed he was throwing life jackets to drowning men, but he failed to notice that some of those men were actually pulling him under to keep their own heads above water. For Arthur, the line between generosity and self-destruction was blurred by a lifetime of being told that a man's worth is measured by what he can provide. We are going to deconstruct the mechanics of his relationships to see if his generosity was a shield or if it was actually a target painted on his back. It is a harsh reality to face, but sometimes the people we think we are saving are the ones who have been waiting for the right moment to let us go. Perhaps the most pressing question of all is centered around a single moment of defiance. What was the one no that caused Arthur's entire world to finally self-destruct? In a life defined by 1,000 yes, it was one solitary refusal that acted as the pull thread on his entire existence. We are going to trace the events leading up to that moment, examining the pressure, the expectations, and the ultimate betrayal that forced a man who never quit to finally draw a line in the sand. This isn't just a story about a bad business deal or a neighborhood dispute. This is an investigation into the cost of boundaries and the shocking consequences that follow when a provider decides he can no longer provide. The answer to this mystery will change the way you look at every favor you've ever done for a friend. To truly understand Arthur Vance, you have to understand the soil he was built from. Oak Creek wasn't just a place on a map. It was a community that Arthur helped shape with his own hands and his own capital. In the early days, his construction firm was the gold standard for quality and reliability across the state. He wasn't the kind of owner who sat in a trailer with a clipboard. He was the first man on the roof in the middle of a July heatwave, showing his crew that he would never ask them to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. This stoic dedication earned him more than just money. It earned him a level of local legend status that few men ever achieve. He was the anchor of Oak Creek, a man who believed that if you took care of the town would take care of you. The culture at Vance Construction was built on a philosophy that many would consider old-fashioned today. Arthur didn't believe in ironclad contracts or aggressive litigation. He believed in the power of a man's word and the sanctity of a handshake. If a client fell on hard times, Arthur would extend their credit. If an employee had a family emergency, Arthur would reach into his own pocket to make sure the mortgage was paid. To him, the business wasn't just a way to generate profit. It was a vehicle for social good. This perspective made him beloved, but it also created a vacuum where professional boundaries should have been. He was running a multi-million-dollar operation with the heart of a small-town charity worker, and for a long time, the momentum of his success allowed him to ignore the risks of such an arrangement. It was during one of the firm's most prosperous periods that a young man named David entered the frame. David was bright, ambitious, and possessed a charismatic energy that immediately caught Arthur's attention. He arrived at the office looking for a second chance after a series of personal setbacks that would have turned most employers away. But Arthur saw something in him, a hunger for success and a raw talent that just needed the right guidance. Against the advice of his longtime office manager, Arthur decided to take David under his wing, seeing him as the son he never had and the future of the company. He didn't just give David a job. He gave him a seat at the table and an education in the industry that was worth more than any degree. It was a gesture of pure mentorship. For the first few years, the relationship between Arthur and David seemed like a success story for the ages. David was a quick study, taking over the day-to-day management of smaller projects and freeing Arthur up to focus on larger community initiatives. Arthur trusted him implicitly, eventually granting him access to sensitive financial accounts and giving him the authority to sign off on major purchases. They spent long evenings on Arthur's porch, discussing the future of the firm and the ways they could continue to expand their influence in Oak Creek. To the outside world, they were a formidable team, the seasoned veteran and the brilliant protege working in perfect harmony. Arthur felt a profound sense of pride watching David grow, believing that his investment in the young man was the greatest contribution he could make to the next generation. However, if you look closely at the records from that time, you can see the first indications that something was shifting. Small discrepancies in the material costs began to appear, and certain subcontractors started complaining about delayed payments that Arthur had already authorized. When Arthur confronted David about these issues, David always had a logical explanation: a clerical error, a misunderstanding with a vendor, or a temporary cash flow crunch. Arthur, wanting to believe in the man he had built, accepted these excuses without a second thought. He didn't want to admit that his judgment might have been flawed, or that the person he had brought into his inner circle might have different priorities. This was the period where the shadow of doubt was first cast, though Arthur was too busy being the hero of the story to notice. To truly grasp how Arthur Vance reached this point of total isolation, we have to travel back to the late 90s and early 2000s, a time when the world seemed to reward the kind of man he was. In Oak Creek, Arthur was the archetype of the classic American provider, a man who believed that a reputation was built brick by brick and that your word was a sacred bond. He didn't need 20-page contracts or a team of lawyers to close a deal. He needed a firm handshake and a look in the eye. This wasn't just a business strategy for Arthur. It was his entire identity. He saw himself as the guardian of his community, the silent engine that kept the town running when the gears began to grind. He took immense pride in being the man people turned to in their darkest hours, never realizing that he was teaching everyone around him that his time, his money, and his energy had no fixed price. This philosophy of unchecked generosity is exactly what led him to David, a young man who appeared in Arthur's life like a mirror of his own younger self. David arrived with a polished smile and a story of hard knocks that pulled at every one of Arthur's heartstrings. Seeing a raw talent that simply needed a steady hand to guide it, Arthur didn't just offer David a job at the construction firm. He offered him a seat at his family dinner table. He mentored David with a patience that bordered on the religious, often spending hours after the sun went down explaining the nuances of the trade and the importance of integrity. Arthur felt a profound sense of purpose in this mentorship, believing that by molding David into a successful man, he was fulfilling his highest calling as a leader. He ignored the whispers from his long-term crew about David's shortcut taking and his tendency to avoid accountability when things went wrong on a job site. As the years passed, a pattern began to emerge that everyone except Arthur seemed to notice. Whenever David made a costly error, whether it was miscalculating a bid or damaging expensive equipment, Arthur would quietly step in and absorb the loss. He would tell himself that it was part of the learning process, a necessary investment in the young man's future. He would stay late at the office, moving numbers around and dipping into his own personal savings to ensure that the company's reputation remained spotless. all while David was out enjoying the fruits of a success he hadn't fully earned. Arthur's kindness was effectively acting as a veil, obscuring the reality that David was becoming increasingly dependent on Arthur's willingness to fail on his behalf. This wasn't just mentorship anymore. It was a slow-motion transfer of wealth and stability from a man who had earned it to a man who simply expected it as his due. While Arthur was busy being the hero of Oak Creek and the savior of David's career, the silent cost was beginning to manifest within the four walls of his own home. His wife, a woman who had stood by him since they were teenagers, began to feel like a secondary character in her own life. She spent countless evenings sitting at a beautifully set dinner table, watching the food grow cold while Arthur was out fixing a neighbor's plumbing or helping David navigate another emergency. The tragedy of the classic provider is often that they are so focused on the needs of the world that they neglect the needs of the people right in front of them. Arthur believed that by providing a large house and a stable life, he was fulfilling his duties, failing to see that his absence was a form of emotional bankruptcy. His kindness to others was, in many ways, a theft of the time and attention that belonged to his family. By the mid-2000s, the structural integrity of Arthur's life was far more fragile than the buildings he constructed. He had created a world where he was the only one holding up the ceiling, and the weight was starting to take a physical toll. You could see it in the way he walked and the way he would sometimes stare into the distance during meetings, his mind clearly working through 1,000 different problems that weren't actually his to solve. He had become a man who was admired by everyone but known by no one, trapped in a persona of strength that he couldn't afford to drop. The irony was that while he thought he was building a community of friends, he was actually building a gallery of spectators who were only there for the show. They loved the version of Arthur that gave everything away, but they had no interest in the man beneath the cape. The foreshadowing of the eventual collapse was hidden in the small, everyday interactions that Arthur chose to ignore. It was in the way David would speak to subcontractors when Arthur wasn't around, using Arthur's name to exert a level of authority he hadn't earned. It was in the way the town council began to expect Arthur to perform miracles for the city budget without ever offering anything in return. Arthur saw these things as a testament to his influence, rather than red flags of a growing parasitic relationship. He was so committed to his role as the man of gold that he couldn't imagine a world where people wouldn't return his loyalty. He truly believed that if he ever stumbled, 1,000 hands would reach out to catch him. He had no idea that those same hands were already busy reaching into his pockets, waiting for the moment his strength finally gave out. As we look back at this decade of Arthur's life, we see a man who was essentially working against his own survival. He was the architect of his own vulnerability, meticulously removing his own safety nets in the name of being a good guy. He had convinced himself that boundaries were a sign of weakness, and that saying no was a betrayal of his character. This period of his life was the setup for a perfect storm, where his professional success and his personal identity were so inextricably linked to his generosity that losing one meant losing the other. He was heading toward a cliff at full speed, cheered on by the very people who would eventually watch him fall with a cold, detached curiosity. The stage was set, the players were in position, and Arthur Vance was about to learn that in the real world, no good deed goes unpunished. The year 2024 was supposed to be the victory lap for Vance Construction, the moment when Arthur finally solidified his place in the history of Oak Creek. He had secured a massive development contract that promised to revitalize the downtown area, a project so ambitious it required every ounce of his credit and nearly all of his remaining personal liquidity. To Arthur, this wasn't just another job. It was a promise made to the people he had known his entire life. He spent 18 hours a day on the site, his body screaming for rest that his mind wouldn't allow. He was shouldering the financial risks for subcontractors who couldn't get bonded and covering the payroll for men who were still learning the trade under David's supposed supervision. But behind the scenes, something darker was lurking, a series of shadows that had been stretching longer with every passing month of Arthur's unchecked generosity. The weight of the world finally proved too heavy for even a man of Arthur's stature. In the early hours of a Tuesday morning, while reviewing a set of blueprints that didn't seem to add up, a crushing pressure seized his chest. It wasn't the dramatic collapse you see in movies. It was a slow, agonizing realization that his heart was finally protesting the decades of abuse he had put it through. He managed to call for help, and as he was wheeled into the emergency room with a minor heart attack, his primary concern wasn't his own survival. He was worried about the concrete pour scheduled for 8 in the morning and the checks that needed to be signed for the suppliers. He believed that his absence would be felt as a tragedy, a moment for the community to rally around the man who had rallied for them for 30 years. For the first time in 3 decades, Arthur Vance could not show up. He lay in a sterile hospital room, tethered to monitors and ordered into absolute stillness, while his phone buzzed incessantly on the bedside table. In his heart, he expected messages of concern, offers of help, and prayers for a speedy recovery. He reached for the device with trembling hands, hoping to see the gratitude of a town he had practically built from the ground up. But as he scrolled through the notifications, the warmth he expected was replaced by a cold, sharp realization. There were no get-well-soon cards in his inbox. Instead, the screen was a wall of demands. The very people he had bailed out of debt were now asking why their payments were 2 hours late, their tones stripped of the friendly veneer they had worn for years. The messages from David were perhaps the most cutting of all. There was no mention of Arthur's health or the bond they supposedly shared as mentor and protege. David's texts were clinical and demanding, focused entirely on the chaos at the job site and the looming deadlines that Arthur was no longer there to manage. It became clear that to David and the rest of Oak Creek, Arthur wasn't a friend or a neighbor. He was a machine that had suddenly broken down, and they were angry at the inconvenience. The kindness Arthur had distributed so freely hadn't built a reservoir of goodwill. It had built an expectation of infinite service. He was seeing the true face of the people he loved, and it was a face twisted by an entitlement that he had inadvertently cultivated through his own lack of boundaries. The tension reached a breaking point on the 3rd day of his hospital stay. Arthur sat propped up against the pillows, watching the rain hit the window, trying to process the silence from his so-called friends. That was when a man in a cheap suit entered the room, looking around with a detached, professional air. He wasn't a doctor or a concerned citizen. He was a process server. With a mumbled apology that carried no weight, he dropped a thick envelope onto Arthur's lap, a legal summons. As Arthur opened the documents, the monitor hooked to his heart began to beat faster. He wasn't being sued by a faceless corporation or a distant bank. He was being sued for breach of contract by the very local investors and business partners whose personal debts he had personally covered just 12 months prior. Reading through the legal jargon, the betrayal felt more painful than the heart attack itself. They were alleging gross negligence and financial mismanagement, claiming that Arthur's sudden health crisis was a sign of his inability to fulfill his professional obligations. They were moving to freeze his remaining assets and seize the very home he had worked his entire life to protect. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They weren't waiting for him to get better. They were moving in to strip the carcass before he even had a chance to stand up. The shield of virtue he thought he was wearing had been shattered, and he was left completely exposed. In his hospital bed, surrounded by the hum of machines, Arthur Vance realized that the people he had saved from bankruptcy were now using his own kindness as the evidence to destroy him. This was the moment the narrative shifted from a story of struggle to one of survival. Arthur looked at the names on the lawsuit, names of men he had invited to his house for Thanksgiving, men whose children's tuition he had quietly helped fund when things were tight. He saw David's name listed as a witness for the prosecution, a detail that felt like a knife twisted in an old wound. The protege he had raised as a son was now the primary architect of his professional execution. It was a cold, calculated move designed to shift the blame for the project's failures away from David's mismanagement and onto Arthur's aging shoulders. The world was telling Arthur that his time as a provider was over, and if he couldn't be useful, he would be discarded with clinical efficiency. As the sun began to set over the hospital parking lot, Arthur realized that the orange foreclosure notice he would eventually see on his door was being drafted in that very moment. He had been so busy being the hero that he never noticed the villains were the ones sitting in his front row. He was a man with nothing left but his name, and even that was being dragged through the mud by the people who owed him the most. The question wasn't just how he would recover his health, but how he would survive the coming storm of litigation and loss. He had spent a lifetime building bridges, only to find that every one of them was being burned from both ends. He was alone in a way he hadn't been since he was a boy, and the silence was deafening. In the weeks following Arthur's discharge from the hospital, the investigation into the collapse of Vance Construction shifted from the job site to a stack of bank statements that told a story more harrowing than any physical crime. To the outside observer, it looked like a business that simply grew too fast and buckled under the weight of its own ambition. But as we begin to peel back the layers of what we call the ledger of betrayal, a different reality emerges. Arthur wasn't just losing money. He was being systematically drained by a network of people who viewed his generosity as an invitation to exploit him. When we look at the graphics of Arthur's outflows versus his inflows, the data is staggering. For every dollar Arthur earned through his own labor, nearly 60 cents was being diverted to cover the failures, debts, and personal luxuries of his friends and his protege, David. This brings us to a dark corner of human psychology that explains why a man like Arthur goes from a pillar of the community to a social outcast. There is a deeply uncomfortable truth in the giver-taker dynamic. People often grow to resent the person who saves them. When Arthur bailed out his neighbors or covered David's mounting mistakes, he wasn't just giving them money. He was inadvertently creating a debt of gratitude that most people are too small to carry. Psychologically, it is much easier for a person to vilify their benefactor than it is to admit they are incapable of surviving without them. By the time the project in Oak Creek began to fail, the people who owed Arthur the most didn't see a savior. They saw a reminder of their own inadequacy. They needed Arthur to be the villain so they could stop feeling like the failures he had spent years protecting. During the height of this financial autopsy, several red herrings began to circulate through the gossip mills of Oak Creek, casting doubt on Arthur's true character. There were whispers that his wife was preparing to leave him, fueled by her frequent absences from the house and her sightings at a lawyer's office in the next county over. The public assumption was that she was jumping ship before the final collapse, abandoning the man who had given her everything. There were also rumors that Arthur was secretly hiding millions in offshore accounts, playing the poor man while his workers went unpaid. Even his stoic silence was interpreted as the behavior of a guilty man. These narratives were a convenient distraction from the truth, pushed heavily by David to ensure that the public's anger remained focused on the man at the top rather than the people who were actually bleeding him dry. However, when the forensic accountants finally gained access to Arthur's private records, the revelation was far more tragic than anyone could have guessed. His wife wasn't visiting a divorce attorney. She was meeting with a specialist to see if they could sell her family's estate to cover the firm's payroll. And there was no hidden treasure. In fact, Arthur Vance had done something that most rational business owners would find insane. Over the last 18 months, he had completely drained his personal retirement fund, nearly $2 million, not to save his business, but to pay off the private debts of his business partners and David. He had sacrificed his own future and the future of his wife to protect the reputations of the very men who were currently testifying against him in court. He was bankrupt because he refused to let anyone else fail. The investigation into David's role revealed a trail of digital breadcrumbs that suggested a far more calculated betrayal than a simple business disagreement. While Arthur was busy sacrificing his retirement, David was setting up a shell company in his own name, slowly siphoning off the high-quality equipment and materials from Vance Construction's inventory. David knew that Arthur's heart was his greatest weakness, and he played it like an instrument. He would come to Arthur with stories of family emergencies or unexpected vendor demands, and Arthur, trapped in his role as the eternal provider, would simply sign the checks without looking at the fine print. David wasn't just a protege who made mistakes. He was a student of Arthur's character who realized that as long as he kept playing the victim, Arthur would keep playing the hero until there was nothing left to give. By the time the full extent of this parasitic relationship was laid bare, the damage was already done. The community of Oak Creek, fed on a diet of misinformation and their own hidden resentments, had already moved on. They didn't want to hear about Arthur's sacrifice or the forensic evidence of David's theft. It was much cleaner for them to believe that the nice guy was secretly a fraud than to accept that they had watched a good man be destroyed by his own goodness. Arthur sat in his darkened living room, the quiet hum of the refrigerator the only sound in a house that used to be filled with the laughter of guests who now wouldn't even look him in the eye at the grocery store. He was realizing that the cost of always helping others isn't just a financial figure. It is the total loss of your own narrative. As the legal proceedings moved toward a climax, the investigation shifted from the past to the present. We started looking at the one person who hadn't spoken up, Arthur himself. He had spent his life being the voice for everyone else, the advocate for the underdog, and the protector of the weak. But in the face of his own destruction, he remained unervingly silent. This silence was interpreted by many as a confession of guilt, but those who knew him best, the few who remained, knew it was something else. It was the silence of a man who had finally realized that the bridge he had built across the canyon was being held up by his own broken body, and he no longer had the strength to keep the structure from falling. He was waiting for the final blow, curious to see just how far the people he loved would go to ensure he stayed down. The investigation also uncovered the chilling reality of the lawsuit filed against him. It wasn't just about the money. It was a strategic move to ensure Arthur could never work in the state again. If he was found guilty of the mismanagement David and the investors were alleging, his bonding and insurance would be revoked forever. They weren't just taking his house and his savings. They were taking his ability to ever rebuild. It was a professional execution disguised as a civil dispute. As we look at the documents, it becomes clear that David had been consulting with the investors for months, coaching them on how to frame Arthur's generosity as unstable behavior. They were turning his greatest virtue into his greatest liability, creating a trap that was as much about character assassination as it was about financial gain. The climax of Arthur Vance's downfall didn't take place on a construction site or in a bank vault, but in a wood-paneled courtroom where the air felt heavy with the scent of old paper and cold ambition. As the legal proceedings reached their peak, the town of Oak Creek tuned in, expecting to see a final reckoning for a man they now viewed as a failure. David, the protege who had once looked at Arthur with something resembling worship, took the stand with a calm, practiced composure that chilled the few friends Arthur had left. He spoke about misplaced trust and unstable leadership, framing every act of kindness Arthur had ever shown him as a calculated move to keep him subservient. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, a public stripping of Arthur's dignity that felt more violent than any physical altercation. The audience watched as David played the role of the victimized successor, but a single piece of evidence was about to change the entire nature of the case. During the cross-examination, a leaked audio recording from a private meeting between David and the group of investors was entered into the record. The voice on the tape was unmistakably David's, but the tone was one Arthur had never heard. It was sharp, mocking, and entirely devoid of the warmth David used to manipulate his mentor. In the recording, David wasn't talking about business strategy or project timelines. He was talking about Arthur's heart. He spoke about how easy it was to trigger Arthur's hero complex, and how he had intentionally stalled the downtown project to force Arthur to dip further into his personal reserves. The shock that rippled through the courtroom was audible. It wasn't just a matter of greed or a business deal gone bad. This was a premeditated psychological execution. David hadn't just been stealing Arthur's money. He had been orchestrating a scenario where Arthur's total ruin was the only possible outcome. The true motive, however, was the most devastating revelation of all. When the lawyer pushed David on why he would go to such lengths to destroy a man who had given him everything, the mask finally slipped. David didn't hate Arthur because Arthur was a bad man. He hated Arthur because Arthur was a good man. He spoke with a sudden, raw vitriol about the burden of being helped. He explained that every time Arthur bailed him out, every time Arthur covered a mistake or gave him a second chance, it felt like a slap in the face. To David, Arthur's constant kindness was a constant reminder of his own inadequacy. He didn't want a mentor. He wanted to stop feeling inferior to a man who seemed to have no breaking point. He realized that as long as Arthur was successful and generous, David would always be the charity case. The only way for David to feel like he had truly arrived was to burn down the house of the man who built it. This is the dark paradox of extreme generosity that we rarely discuss. When you help everyone without exception, your help eventually loses its value and becomes a baseline expectation. But even worse than that, you unknowingly become a mirror for the people around you. A mirror that reflects their own weaknesses, their own lack of discipline, and their own failures. For someone like David, that reflection was unbearable. By destroying Arthur, David wasn't just trying to get rich. He was trying to kill the evidence of his own mediocrity. He wanted to look in the mirror and see a self-made man, even if that meant building his throne on the ashes of the person who loved him most. It was a revelation that turned the courtroom silent, as the people of Oak Creek were forced to look at their own reflections and realize how they, too, had benefited from a man they were now happy to see destroyed. Arthur Vance sat at the defense table, his head bowed, listening to the voice of the man he had treated like a son describe him as a nuisance to be removed. The betrayal was so complete that it transcended anger. It was a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He realized in that moment that his mistake wasn't just a lack of financial oversight. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. He believed that kindness would create a community of equals, but instead, he had created a hierarchy where he was the permanent giver and everyone else was a permanent taker. This dynamic had bred a resentment so toxic it had poisoned the very town he tried to save. The real cost of always helping others wasn't just the millions of dollars or the house on the hill. It was the realization that his life's work had actually made the people he loved into smaller, meaner versions of themselves. The voiceover for this segment of the documentary would need to be cold and analytical, reflecting the harsh light now shining on the situation. When you help everyone, your help loses value. But worse, you become a constant reminder of their own weakness. This sentence serves as the epitaph for Arthur's career. The courtroom drama revealed that the lawsuit wasn't a search for justice, but a tool used by the weak to punish the strong for the crime of being reliable. David's orchestration was so thorough that even with the recording, the damage to Arthur's credit and reputation was nearly irreversible. The legal trap had been set with such precision that the truth almost didn't matter. The investors, realizing they had been used as pawns in David's personal vendetta, began to back away. But the financial machinery they had set in motion was already grinding Arthur's life into dust. As the judge called for a recess, Arthur didn't move. He watched David walk out of the courtroom, surrounded by a new circle of associates, already looking for his next victim. The protégé had learned the business well, but he had learned the dark art of manipulation even better. Arthur looked at his own hands, the calloused hands of a builder, and realized that for the first time in his life, he had no desire to pick up a hammer. The revelation of David's motive had done what the heart attack and the foreclosure couldn't. It had broken Arthur's spirit. He had spent his life believing that people were essentially good and that generosity was the ultimate virtue. To find out that his goodness was the very thing that triggered such malice was a blow from which he knew he would never truly recover. The final moments of this chapter focus on the transition from the courtroom back to the reality of Arthur's new life. The legal battle would drag on, but the emotional climax had already occurred. The mystery of why his world had self-destructed was solved, but the answer provided no comfort. It only provided a warning to anyone else who thinks that yes is the only answer a good man should give. The audience is left with the image of Arthur sitting alone, the weight of the revelation settling over him like a shroud. He was no longer the hero of Oak Creek. He was a man who had learned, far too late, that the most expensive thing you can ever give someone is your own soul. The stage was now set for the final twist, one that would occur far away from the cameras and the lawyers, in the quiet corners of a life rebuilt from scratch. The legal machinery of Oak Creek moved with a cold, indifferent speed that no amount of previous goodwill could slow down. Within months of the courtroom revelation, the gavel finally fell, and the result was exactly what the spreadsheets had predicted. Arthur Vance, the man who had spent 30 years building the roofs over his neighbors' heads, was officially ordered to vacate his own. He watched from the sidewalk as a moving crew, men he had likely given their first jobs, carried out the furniture he had bought with 3 decades of honest sweat. The house was sold at auction for a fraction of its value to a developer with ties to the very investors who had sued him. It was the ultimate irony. The sanctuary he had built for his family was now just another line item on someone else's balance sheet. Arthur stood there with nothing but a few boxes and a sense of displacement that felt like a physical weight in his chest. A few days after the keys were handed over, Arthur found himself sitting in a booth at a dimly lit diner on the edge of town, a place where the coffee was bitter and the patrons didn't care about local scandals. He was joined by an old, retired judge named Marcus, a man who had seen the rise and fall of 1,000 reputations in Oak Creek. Arthur expected sympathy. He expected the judge to lament the unfairness of the world and the cruelty of David's betrayal. Instead, the old man looked at him with eyes that had seen too much truth and delivered a blow that hurt more than the foreclosure. He told Arthur that his problem wasn't that he was too good for this world, but that he was a hostage to his own ego. He suggested that Arthur's constant yes wasn't an act of selfless love, but a desperate need to be the hero of every story. He told him that he had confused being needed with being loved, and in doing so, he had built a life on a foundation of sand. This realization was the true turning point for Arthur Vance. He moved into a modest, one-bedroom apartment in a part of the city where no one knew his name or his history. The rooms were small, the walls were thin, and for the first time in his adult life, he was responsible for no one but himself. The silence was terrifying at first, a constant reminder of the community he had lost, but slowly, it began to feel like a sanctuary. The moment of truth came when a distant family member tracked him down, calling with a familiar, frantic story about an unpaid bill and a looming crisis. For a moment, the old Arthur reached for his checkbook, the habitual hero, ready to jump into the fray. But then he remembered the judge's words. He took a deep breath and simply said, "No." He waited for the sky to fall or for his heart to stop, but the world didn't end. The person on the other end of the line was angry, then manipulative, and finally, they hung up. Arthur sat in his quiet apartment and realized he was still standing. The resolution of Arthur's story isn't one of a triumphant return to power or a sudden windfall of wealth. It is a story of a man who finally learned the value of his own boundaries. He found work as a consultant for a small firm 2 towns over, earning a modest salary that allowed him to live with dignity, but without the crushing weight of being everyone else's savior. He started spending his weekends in the park, reading books he had meant to get to 20 years ago, and taking long walks with his wife, who had stayed through the fire and found that she actually preferred the man in the small apartment to the hero in the mansion. They discovered that they had more to talk about now that they weren't constantly discussing other people's problems. Arthur Vance hadn't just survived a tragedy. He had survived his own reputation. As we look back at the wreckage of his former life, the philosophical reflection is unavoidable. The cost of always helping others isn't just the money you lose or the stress that wears down your heart. The real cost is the life you never got to live because you were too busy living theirs. Every time Arthur said yes to a neighbor's request or David's latest emergency, he was saying no to his own peace of mind, his own hobbies, and his own family. He had spent his existence being a bridge, and he forgot that a bridge is meant to be walked on, not lived on. By trying to save everyone else from the consequences of their choices, he had robbed them of the chance to grow and robbed himself of the chance to simply be a man instead of a monument. Today, if you were to see Arthur Vance walking down a street in his new neighborhood, you wouldn't see a broken man. You would see a man who moves with a quiet, deliberate purpose. He still helps people. He'll hold a door or jumpstart a car, but he no longer carries the weight of the world on his shoulders. He has learned that true kindness requires the strength to say no, and that a life of service is only virtuous if it doesn't require the sacrifice of your own soul. The orange notice on his old front door was the end of a house, but it was the beginning of a home within himself. He finally understood that he didn't need to be everyone's hero to be someone's husband, or more importantly, to be his own man. Was justice really served in the case of Arthur Vance? On paper, the villains won. David kept the stolen equipment, the investors kept the land, and the town of Oak Creek moved on to its next favorite story. But as we see Arthur sitting on a park bench, watching the sun set without the fear of a ringing phone, we have to wonder who actually walked away with the prize. Would you have spotted the red flags that Arthur ignored for decades? Or are you, like so many of us, currently building a bridge that you can't afford to hold up? The story of Arthur Vance is a mirror for every person who thinks their value is tied to their usefulness. It's a warning that the most dangerous person in your life might not be the one who hates you, but the one who needs you too much. As we conclude this investigation into the real cost of kindness, we are left with a final, haunting question that we should all ask ourselves before we offer the next favor. If you stopped being useful today, who would still be standing by your side tomorrow? For Arthur, The answer was smaller than he expected, but far more valuable than anything he had lost. He learned that the people who truly love you don't need you to be a hero. They just need you to be there. And in the end, that was the only yes that ever really mattered. Now that we've reached the end of this journey, it's time to look inward. The story of Arthur Vance isn't just a cautionary tale about business or a bad protege. It's a mirror for anyone who has ever felt like their only value lies in what they can do for others. Have you ever felt like Arthur? Have you reached a point where you realize that the more you give, the less people actually see you as a human being with your own needs and your own limits? We want to hear from you. Tell us your story in the comments below. Sometimes just saying it out loud and acknowledging the weight you've been carrying is the very first step towards setting a boundary and reclaiming your life. Your experiences might be the wake-up call someone else in this community needs to hear today. It is a difficult transition to make, moving from the person who saves everyone to the person who saves themselves. But as Arthur discovered, the peace on the other side is worth every bit of the struggle. We are dedicated to exploring these deep, often unspoken realities of the human experience, and we have much more to share with you. If this story resonated with you, stay tuned, because next week we are shifting our focus to a different kind of betrayal. We're looking into the inheritance war, a deep dive into what happens when a family's golden child, the one who was promised everything, is suddenly left with nothing. It is a psychological thriller of a different sort, involving family secrets, legal maneuvers, and the high cost of expectations. You won't want to miss it. Thank you for spending this hour with us as we deconstructed the life and lessons of Arthur Vance. In a world that constantly demands more of your time, your energy, and your spirit, remember that no is not a dirty word. It is a survival tool. Seeing Arthur sitting in that quiet park today, finally reading the books he loves and enjoying the silence, reminds us that it's never too late to rebuild on a foundation of self-respect. If you found value in this documentary and want to see more long-form storytelling that digs beneath the surface of everyday life, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep telling these important stories. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember that your first duty is to the person staring back at you in the mirror.